Okay, so let's talk about this meeting that they had in Riyadh about Ukraine. Let's talk about what it was really about, what it wasn't about, and so on. First of all, it was only marginally about Ukraine. I mean, about Ukraine, there frankly isn't that much to say. Ukraine itself has been continuously losing the war ever since it started. And in my opinion, that was always what it was supposed to do. That's what was supposed to happen. I mean, I don't think anyone who was serious, any serious person, ever imagined that Ukraine was going to defeat Russia. The fact of the matter is, as I've always been saying, the Ukraine war has always been a proxy war by the United States against Europe. And in that regard, it has been a very successful war. From the perspective of the national OCGFC, the Ukraine war served at least two functions. First, the destabilization of Europe, and second, the strengthening of BRICS, which included for example, the creation and the proliferation of alternatives to SWIFT, different trading systems and so forth, the boosting of BRICS economies like India, like South Africa, like China, like the GCC and so on, as well as Russia, as a result of the Russian sanctions, as well as advancing a sort of division of the globe into spheres of influence, with the global north, the West, and so forth, Europe and the European continent falling under American influence, and the rest of the world being for BRICS, the global South being for BRICS, or to simplify it, for China. The Ukraine war has been immensely powerful and immensely useful in accelerating the transition of the global economy that I've always been talking about. So what they are there to discuss in Riyadh, in my opinion, doesn't have so much to do with Ukraine as it has to do with managing the next steps of that transition. So the US is going to want to maintain the dependence of Europe. And that means negotiating the issue of Russian energy, because the only way to keep Europe energy dependent on the United States, which it is now, is to keep Russia or Russian energy out of the European market. See, it's a bit of a tricky thing for Russia because they're a major member of BRICS, but Russia is not a global South country geographically. So that means that Russia is going to share the global North. Basically, it's going to be shared between America and Russia, with the lines of those spheres of influence basically following the Soviet era pattern. I mean, peace and harmony between Russia and Europe is in the interests of both Russia and Europe, obviously, but not so much in the interests of the US, and not so much, arguably, not so much in the interests of BRICS. If Russia is allowed to normalize completely with Europe and become their major energy supplier, then that would drive the US out of the European market, and it would decrease Russia's vested interests in the success of BRICS itself, the BRICS project. So potentially resolving the Ukraine conflict could undo a lot of the progress that has been made towards the transition of the global economy. And I don't think anybody wants that. I don't think even Russia wants that. Now also, of course, for the GCC, for Saudi Arabia, they have a vested interest in all of this as well, because the lifting of sanctions against Russian energy would impact their own market share. Not Saudi Arabia so much, but the GCC, their own market share in Europe and elsewhere. So in other words, what the Riyadh meeting was about, in my opinion, and what the upcoming meeting in Saudi Arabia between Trump and Putin will be about, essentially, isn't Ukraine, but it's negotiating the terms and setting up the dividing lines for the respective spheres of influence. Now, let me be clear here. These negotiations in Riyadh are not negotiations between enemies. These are not negotiations between people who are or who have radically conflicting views of the future. No. As I've said many times, Donald Trump is a representative of the national OCGFC. Putin and MBS are among the major leaders of the global transition of the global economy. And they are among those who will be the leaders in the new management system of international affairs. See, in the global South, as I've talked about before, business, the private sector, remains subordinate to the state for the most part. Or anyway, compared to the US and Europe, it's subordinate to the state. Compared to the US and Europe, where the state is subordinate to business. The national OCGFC are the product of the subordination of state power in the West to the private sector. That's why the eight national OCGFC exists. But when the eight national OCGFC deal with China, or they deal with Russia, or they deal with the GCC, they're dealing with players who hold power in both the private sector and in the state. And those players operate more according to nationalistic interests. They're sort of a regional nationalistic OCGFC in their own right. So unlike a Trump or a Biden or any political leader in the West, a Putin, for example, is genuinely interested in the prosperity and the security of Russia. Xi Jinping is interested in China. MBS is interested in Saudi Arabia, and he's interested in the region, and so on. So they have a nationalistic element to them. Whereas Western leaders do not care about their countries. You see what I mean? So, for instance, when Trump goes to Riyadh, he's not representing America, and he's not representing American interests. He's representing the A-National OCGFC, the A-National Owners and Controllers of Global Financialized Capital. But Putin and MBS are representing the interests of their countries and the interests of their countries' private sector elites. And this is the whole negotiation that's going on over the transition of the global economy. This is the whole negotiation. It's between the A-National OCGFC coming from the West and the regional, more nationalistic OCGFC of different parts of the global South. And they're discussing how the global economy is going to be managed, how it's going to be managed between these factions. So for Trump, or whoever else might be in the White House at any given point, their only nationalistic concern will have to do with the military-industrial complex, which does continue to be, an economic force, and a force in American politics and policy making, though much less than in the past. So as I see it, they have at least two major issues to work out in Riyadh: the future of Europe and the future of the Middle East. The future of the Middle East obviously includes what to do about Israel and what to do about Gaza, which is why Stephen Witkoff was in Riyadh. I mean, he's Trump's envoy to the Middle East. He's the one who got Netanyahu to agree to the ceasefire. He has nothing to do with Ukraine. There's no real reason why he should be there, except that they're going to discuss the Middle East. So in my opinion, they're going to be talking about this. And they will be talking about this when they meet the next time. And because all of these issues are connected in one way or another. Europe, Ukraine, Russian energy exports, and the Middle East, Gaza, Israel, Palestine, so forth. In all of these issues, there are possible trade-offs. Possible trade-offs exist. These are all bargaining chips. So if you look at what each side wants to achieve in these negotiations, Trump, as a representative of the A-National OCGFC, he will want to keep Europe dependent on American energy exports. He will want animosity to continue between Russia and Europe, but with the United States sitting it out on the bench. He'll want the price of energy to decrease for his own domestic popularity, and he'll want access to Ukraine's minerals. He'll want Europe to become dependent also on weapons from the U.S., from U.S. manufacturers, and he'll want Europe to be cut off from China as much as possible. Further than that, he'll want guarantees that he's going to have a share. He himself and his family will have a share in the development of Gaza. He will want the global transition to proceed. He will want American containment to proceed. And he'll want the continued move towards de-dollarization. Don't believe the hype. And he'll want conflict in Europe and so on. So his bargaining chips in the negotiation are the Russian sanctions, U.S. trade policy towards China, American support for Israel, and their military posturing about Iran, among other things. For Russia, they will want control over the Ukraine. They'll want restored access to the energy markets of Europe. And they want generally normalization of trade and business for all Russian companies. This is what Russia would like. Saudi Arabia will want continued access to European energy markets for the GCC. They will want to make sure that Russia's interest and commitment to BRICS will be preserved, and they'll want the establishment of a Palestinian state with Israel defanged. And of course, they'll want guarantees from the U.S. that there will be no interference by them in Bilad al-Sham and in the broader Middle East, Syria, Iraq, and so on. Like I said, the U.S., or rather the A-National OCGFC, they want Europe to remain dependent specifically on American energy. That's going to mean trying to limit Russian influence in European markets and trying to keep the EU on a short leash. They don't want Europe to be completely, destroyed, but they do want for Europe to be weakened, and they want Europe to be subordinate. They want it to be controlled. They want it to be completely within their sphere of influence. Second, they will want, as I say, Ukraine's resources, the minerals, the agricultural land, the energy reserves, and so on. This all has to be brought under Western corporate control. This is what they want. And they want to keep China at a distance from Europe. The global economy is shifting, and Washington is trying to ensure that Europe won't gain any autonomy through building a relationship with China. So what kind of a deal should we expect? Most likely, Russia will keep the territories that they have taken, but they will allow Western economic access to Ukraine's resources. They'll go along with whatever deal is made between the US and the Ukrainians with regards to that. The US will drop their own support for Ukraine, but Europe most likely will continue to support Ukraine to ensure that the war just sort of drags on but never reaches a definitive conclusion and potentially can ignite conflicts elsewhere. Possibly some sanctions against Russia will be lifted, especially where it benefits multinational corporations. I think that energy prices will probably be stabilized for the right people. Oil prices will probably want to stay within a controlled range, as they always have, so that Saudi Arabia and Russia and the U.S. U.S. corporate interests all benefit, not America itself, but their corporate interests. Russia will probably retain limited access to the European market in terms of energy, but only in a way that doesn't undermine America's energy dominance. Just it's been the case like this all along, actually. Europe is going to be further weakened, and they're going to be further tied to the U.S. The U.S. will ensure that Europe remains militarily dependent upon the U.S. U.S. weapons manufacturers, increasing their purchases and so on of weapons, of American weapons. European industries are going to be completely locked into American energy supplies, preventing them from pivoting to Russia or to China. I think BRICS will continue to grow. The U.S. isn't interested in stopping BRICS expansion, but they will work behind the scenes to try to keep it somewhat financially fragmented. Saudi Arabia is going to stay aligned with BRICS, but they will also maintain their ties to Western financial systems. They're going to work on some sort of a deal about Gaza. I think that the U.S. and the Gulf are going to take control of the reconstruction with Gulf financing and with some American partners being involved. But I think that the plan for the Middle East, the plan for Gaza, the plan for Palestine, and that whole region is basically being worked out to the exclusion of the U.S. I think Saudi Arabia is going to have the major say over the political landscape in Gaza, alongside Egypt. See, this meeting in Riyadh was about how the system is going to be managed going forward, the global system. It was more about the future of Europe than anything else. Russia is going to keep its territories, but they will accommodate Western economic interests. Saudi Arabia is going to preserve their influence, but they will also stay tied to one extent or another to Western financial structures so that the U.S. can stay involved in terms of for profit reasons. See, none of this is a battle between nations. This is a negotiation among elites, ensuring that the financialized global system remains intact. It just who's managing it and whose interests are being served. The conflicts and the crises and so forth are all going to be managed for their benefit. This is why it's useful to have an overview, a sort of a theoretical framework for looking at, current affairs, current events, and news headlines and so forth. A framework for understanding power dynamics. Because when you understand what the interests are for the various power players in any given scenario, you can analyze more accurately what's actually going on and what's likely to happen, how it's likely to all play out. Like I said before about Trump, he is dismantling the American empire. There's no question about that. The national OCGFC want America to be contained because they don't want sort of nationalistic, short-sighted policies to disrupt the conditions around the world in places where they have interests. More specifically, in places where securing their interests requires collaborative relationships with the regional nationalistic OCGFC. Because, I mean, wherever America goes, it breaks things. So they want the U.S. to be isolated on the global stage as much as possible. And of course, they also want to prey upon America itself. The A national OCGFC want to prey upon America itself. I mean, this is obvious from Trump's economic policies. Like, again, the tariffs. We talked about it before. It's important to understand. Tariffs are being presented as some sort of a magic technique for bolstering the domestic economy in the U.S., but that's all hype. That's all just hype. The reality is the complete opposite of that. I mean, the idea that tariffs will make America great again, the basis for that is an obsolete sort of nationalistic framework that no longer reflects the way the global economy actually functions. I mean, tariffs were once an effective tool for the U.S. when the U.S. was an industrial power engaged in genuine production and genuine competition. But the American economy today, you can barely even call it a national economy in any meaningful sense. It's become a subordinate structure within the A national OCGFC, owners and controllers of global financialized capital, in which capital flows and wealth extraction supersede national interests, and where traditional economic policies such as tariffs are not designed to benefit the working class. They're not designed to bolster domestic production, but to help the corporate and financial elite. I mean, Trump's tariff policies are rationalized on the basis that you will assume that America's economic woes are due to unfair foreign competition. I mean, this argument would be valid in a world where the U.S. was still structured around industrial production, but that hasn't been the case for a very long time. America's economic landscape has been completely transformed by financialization, where wealth is no longer generated by producing goods, but by financial speculation, monopolistic control, the systematic extraction of rent from debt, from real estate, digital economies, and so on. It's not China or Mexico or the European Union that have gutted American manufacturing. It's Wall Street. It's your own country, your own elites, your own power structure did that. Corporate executives no longer prioritize reinvesting in production, in training workers, in expanding manufacturing capacity, and so on. That's not where the money is. They engage in stock buybacks, debt-financed expansion, asset inflation. The objective is no longer to produce goods, but to inflate balance sheets and maximize shareholder returns. This is why imposing tariffs won't in any way whatsoever incentivize companies to bring their factories back. Rather than investing in domestic production, corporations are simply going to shift their supply chains and raise their prices and increase automation. The cost of tariffs is going to be passed down to consumers. It's only going to make it hard for consumers, as everyone knows this. Actual industrial capacity will remain stagnant or continue to decline. The sectors that dominate the U.S. economy today are not engaged in production, but sectors of the economy that are engaged in extraction, finance, like I say, real estate, and these technology monopolies like Google and Apple and so forth, Meta. These rentier elites control the essential services of modern life in America: housing, healthcare, education, even public utilities. They've transformed all of these into profit-generating assets rather than public goods. Tariffs will only exacerbate economic inequality because they will, as I say, drive up consumer prices while providing no tangible structural benefit to the working class, to the people. The financial elite will capitalize by leveraging inflation to justify high interest rates, pushing more people into debt. The very households that suffer from the rising costs will be the same ones who are forced into greater dependence on credit cards, on loans, on, same day, payday lenders. What do you call it? Payday lenders. The net result will be redistribution of wealth upwards from the struggling households to the financial institutions that profit from their desperation. And this isn't accidental. A national industrial policy can only be effective if a country has the production infrastructure to actually replace what it imports. That's the key that's missing here. The United States doesn't have that. Nearly every essential consumer good, from electronics to textiles to machinery to pharmaceuticals, it's imported. Decades and decades of offshoring, encouraged by corporate interests, cheap labor overseas, has left the U.S. economy structurally dependent on foreign manufacturing. Tariffs don't help in any way in this regard. They don't alter that reality. They're merely making things more expensive. That's all the tariffs will do. When import costs rise, the companies don't suddenly decide to start new factories in Ohio or Michigan. That's irrational. They'll just pass the cost on to consumers, and they'll find other ways to cut their expenses, typically through layoffs, automation, or even more outsourcing. As a result, American workers are not going to gain new jobs or higher wages. They're simply going to get burdened with higher costs of living. That's what tariffs will do. Inflation will rise, disposable incomes will decline, and economic pressure will intensify on the very demographic group that Trump claims to protect. America's global dominance was not built on tariffs or on manufacturing, but on financial supremacy. The dollar functions so far as the world's reserve currency, and that enables the U.S. to maintain massive trade deficits without suffering the economic consequences that would cripple other nations and that other nations wouldn't be able to evade. But by weaponizing tariffs and using economic coercion against key trade partners, Trump's policies will only accelerate the global trend towards de-dollarization, and I think that's intentional. Major economic players like China and Russia and India, the whole BRICS bloc, are increasingly shifting their trade away from the dollar. And Trump is doing nothing but help that. If he continues to alienate nations around the world through aggressive tariff policies, they're going to have an even greater incentive to develop alternative trade mechanisms, using their own currencies, or using the yuan or the ruble or what have you, or even digital currencies, even commodity-based trade systems and so forth. This just weakens the dollar's global position, which is going to do nothing but make it harder for the U.S. to finance its deficits. And that's going to make it even harder for them to sustain their empire, which is the whole point. I mean, the very foundation of the American empire is going to erode. It's not going to strengthen. The result of Trump's tariff strategy will not at all be a revival for American industry. Rather, it will only be higher costs for consumers with no corresponding increase in domestic production. There's not going to be a whole bunch of factories opening. There's going to be a greater burden on workers. There's going to be more inflation. There's going to be stagnant wages, greater and greater household debt. The rentier class is going to profit from economic instability, while everyday people in America are going to continue to struggle to make ends meet. It's going to get harder and harder. There's going to be a further decline in America's global influence as I say, key trade partners are going to accelerate their departure from U.S.-centric economic systems. And again, this is by design. This is exactly what they want to happen. This isn't about restoring America's strength through tariffs. This is about actually exploiting the fragility of the system itself. The U.S. is no longer a sovereign industrial power. It's a rentier-dominated financial empire, rent-seeking system, living off the extracted wealth of a system that is becoming increasingly unstable. I mean, if Trump was serious about reversing America's decline, then tariffs would not be the way he would go. Rather, you would dismantle this whole system of financialized capital that's hijacked and undermined, sabotaged the economy. That would mean, breaking up monopolies, breaking up the rentier industries that profit from artificial scarcity, and the monopolistic control over essential goods and services. It would mean reversing financialization by prohibiting corporate stock buybacks, curbing speculation, redirecting capital into productive investment, and so on, requiring that. and actually rebuilding industrial capacity, not through protectionism, but through structural economic reforms that would incentivize production over speculation, which again goes back to definancialization. You would have to try to rein in the A national OCGFC that operates beyond borders, beyond national borders, and prioritizes corporate wealth over public prosperity. You have to rein that in. Tariffs are not a real economic strategy at all. They're a political distraction. It's a gimmick that's designed to just placate a disenfranchised working class, while the ruling elites just continue to pursue their extractive rent-seeking agenda. Without confronting the realities of the system of financialized capital and the power structure that sustains it, tariffs will do nothing whatsoever to reverse America's economic decline. Instead, they will only serve to accelerate the inevitable collapse of an empire that produces nothing but debt. They produce nothing but debt. They produce dependence and delusion. But everyone knows that. Like I said, everyone knows this already. The outcome of these policies is well known and predictable and predicted. But these are the desired outcomes. But of course, for Trump and his people, his cabinet and so on, his administration and his supporters, they can all act surprised and shocked when the inevitable collapse occurs. They can blame this, that, or the other for why these great policies that were just brilliant policies, somehow they failed to produce the results that they promised, and they'll get voted out. And the same policies will continue. Because this is the politician's job. Sell policies to the public that are against their interests, sell them in a way that makes them believe that they're in their interests. And then you take the hit, you agree as a politician to take the hit when everyone gets mad about the predictable result. Politicians are effigies, I keep saying. They're elected to take the blame. They're elected to get voted out. They're the ultimate expendables. I've seen people talking about this meeting in Riyadh, and most of the analysts that I've seen, so-called analysts, they look at, how can I say this? Their analysis is completely undermined by their own ideological bias. They're trapped in an ideological way of thinking, and a very obsolete way of thinking about sort of state power, the competition between great states, great nations, and so forth, great powers, great power competition. They've adopted a sort of the framework, the political theories of a Kissinger or like what's his name, Mearsheimer, and so on, where they believe in this concept of, first of all, great states that have their agendas, their geopolitical agendas, and then competition between the great powers. These political theories completely leave out the private sector. The most powerful non-state actors in the world are corporations and the owners and controllers of global financialized capital, and their power surpasses the power of any of these great powers, so-called. Certainly the power of the United States. The United States is subordinate to them. Europe is subordinate to them. So this is always going to be cause serious flaws in your analysis of geopolitical affairs when you don't understand the power of the private sector, and when you misidentify the real drivers of policy as being, first of all, that the controllers of policy are the states themselves and not private sector players, and then when you don't understand the motives for the policies. And then third, I've seen another issue or mistake in the way people analyze, which is that they look at the rhetoric around a policy. They actually listen to what politicians say, and think that is related in any way whatsoever with the actual desired outcomes of policies that they are advocating or that they are implementing. There's no connection. The politician is nothing but a salesman, selling to the public policies that you can't put forward plainly because they're atrocious and because they are against the interests of the population. There are so many analysts I see who are locked in this way of thinking, this ideological way of thinking, and this obsolete way of thinking about state power, and the mistake of listening to what politicians say. In my opinion, like I say, this meeting in Riyadh is not between enemies. It's not between countries that are in conflict, and it's not about trying to resolve the Ukraine conflict. What it's about is determining the future of Europe. It's determining the future of Europe and the future of the Middle East. But I think that the Middle East is largely the future of the Middle East is largely already being determined by the power players in the region and by BRICS, and not as much by the United States. But the United States doesn't want to get left out. The A National OCGFC just don't want to get left out. This is the struggle of the A National OCGFC, trying to make sure that they will have a place in the global system post transition. The U.S. wants to make sure that they have dominant control over their sphere of influence, which they see as being North America and Europe. I think that they have resigned themselves to their sphere of influence being restricted to North America and Europe. Like I say, the difficult part of that is that Russia is also in Europe. Russia is a part of BRICS, but it's not a global South country, but they have interests in Europe and they're right there. And the most logical thing would be for Russia and Europe to have peace and harmony between them. That would be the most logical thing for Europe and the most logical thing for Russia. But that would further restrict America's sphere of influence, because Europe would have autonomy from America were that to happen. Were the Europeans to make peace with the Russians, they could free themselves from American domination, and America's sphere of influence would be basically their own country and Canada. As a regional power, it would be restricted even more if they can't have dominant economic and political influence over Europe. I mean, look at how they did with Europe. This is another thing. People are saying that there's been some huge change in the position of the United States towards Europe between the Biden administration and the Trump administration. No, there's no change. There's no change at all. The U.S. has been hostile towards Europe this whole time. The Biden administration was no less hostile towards Europe than Trump is. It has just reached the point, it has just reached the phase where now you can be overt about it. But they've been sabotaging Europe for 3 years now. There's no reason to believe that they were friends before and now they've suddenly changed their position. No, it's just a progression. It's just following the natural progression of events. The hostility was already there. They were already dealing with them in a hostile manner. They were already subordinating them. They were already subjugating them. They were already sabotaging them. They were already destabilizing them. This isn't the actions of a friend. These aren't the actions of an ally. So if the Europeans are now having the rug pulled out from under them, well, you should have understood from the beginning that that's why you were told to stand on the rug in the first place. America has gotten you to stand on that rug just for the purpose of pulling it out from under you. Now they're getting the rug pulled out from under them, but they should have seen it coming. I've been saying for 3 years now that the war in Ukraine was a proxy war by the United States against Europe, in which Russia and the United States were not on opposite sides. This should be understood. America hasn't been hostile towards Russia. Everything that they did, all of their policies, even the policies of the Biden administration, with the Russian sanctions and so forth, has actually done nothing but strengthen Russia. It has strengthened Russia. It has strengthened Russia's relationship with China. It has strengthened BRICS. It has strengthened all of the BRICS countries. All of the BRICS countries benefited from the Russian sanctions. India benefited from the Russian sanctions. Suddenly, somehow, India has become an exporter of oil as a result of the sanctions against Russia. Europe should have known all along what was going on. It was actually quite blatant. It was as clear as day that you're being undermined, that you're being sabotaged, that you're being destabilized, that you're being industrialized, that your big ally, the United States, is the worst possible kind of friend you could have. But now, see, after all of that work that America has done to undermine Europe, the last thing that they want to see happen is for Europe to fall under Russia's sphere of influence. Part of the whole point of what they've done was to ensure that Europe would be under America's sphere of influence, because they understand that America is now a regional power and that the world is being divided into spheres of influence. So America needs to have North America and Europe under their sphere of influence. Otherwise, they would be left with nothing but their own territorial borders, and Canada. So this is one of the things that has to be sorted out in Riyadh. And this is what I think that they're actually dealing with. Because, as I say, settling the Ukraine conflict is barely anything. There's barely anything to talk about. Russia can get whatever it wants. No one is in a position to dictate terms to Russia at this point. But what is being determined is the future of Europe, and how we will proceed to ensure that Europe will remain an American dependency, that it will be a conflict zone, that it will continue to be subjugated and undermined, and that they will not be rescued by Russia or China. This is one of the main things that they want to negotiate. And then, of course, as I say, they also want to negotiate the future of the Middle East. And they have their bargaining chips with that. America has their bargaining chips with that. America wants to see Gaza rebuilt. They want to see, the A National OCGFC, I should say, rather, want to see Gaza rebuilt. They want to see the end of Zionism. They want to see Israel contained. They want to see the whole region stabilized. But they're dealing with players in the region who have nationalistic interests, like Saudi Arabia, like Egypt, and like Israel. So this makes the negotiations a little bit tricky, because defanging Israel is a bit complex, mostly for domestic reasons in the United States, domestic political reasons. The meeting in Riyadh is very likely to be something of a watershed moment in the history of the transition of the global economy to the global south, and a watershed moment in the history of the development of a new global order, a new management system for the world. And I think that is more what they're talking about in Riyadh than anything else. And Allahu A'lam.